You spoke about also these the video stories that Reuters has, which also become some kind of stock footage for live shots. But there are also these small, uh, movies that journalists make. Many of them are on your podcast as well. I think there was Jonah M. Kessel.
Jonah Kessel, yeah.
So, how do you look at that kind of reporting, and what is the kind of range in which that reporting exists? Those 30-minute films that they create, and where does it all
I
start
mean,
actually?
I don't actually know. I'm not too involved in that. I mean, certainly, Reuters does also produce packaged videos that are, 3 to 5 minutes long, about, about anything kind of, but more general news, human interest, things like that. But the interesting thing that Jonah said in his interview is his team is the team that actually shoots this stuff. But he said the video team is much, much larger than that. And these days you don't, like he said there's just so much video, you don't always need to send somebody to go shoot it. You can use security cam footage. You can use, all the wires. You can use the internet, videos, and get permission to use them. And you can tell a really compelling story without necessarily having to go shoot it, just because of the proliferation of everybody has a camera in their pocket. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I know another journalist who does that kind of work. I haven't had on the podcast, but their visual team, and he won't go shoot stuff, but they'll make incredibly compelling videos about picking apart the killing of George Floyd, or looking at drone bombings in the Middle East and things like that, all based on just footage they find.
I mean, to some extent, also some of these 30-minute news stories kind of become short documentaries in a way, right? Or do you see a clear difference between journalism and documentary filmmaking? Is there, what do you see? Do you see a difference between those two?
I mean, again, this is going way out of my area of expertise, but I think that, documentarians play by a different set of rules. But you'll see similarities because now, journalists are getting more into the documentary space. The New York Times is expanding more into documentaries, and I think they bring the principles of journalism into that. But documentarians themselves, purely documentarians, I think there's a big debate over, where certain lines are, what the rules are, what you can and can't do. And it's a bit more loose, and there's a lot more disagreement. Whereas in journalism, it's a bit more, tightly hewing to facts and reality, and not doing reenactments and things like that some documentarians might do.
Okay.
Do you have a rule book that you can sort of recite off the top of your head? Really important sort of principles, 5 or 6, or is that a very thick book that all of you have to read? This is a very dumb question, but yeah.
No. I mean, I wouldn't say I have something memorized. I mean, Reuters has what's called the trust principles, which we're all supposed to hew to, and we all do. I mean, but I like those because they're very common sense. It's just basically don't do anything that would make somebody feel like their trust has been violated. Don't, represent things in a way that is going to make the reader think you're misleading them. Don't, always be completely upfront with your sources. If you're going to quote them and they want it to be anonymous, talk to them about, well, can I say you work for this ministry, or can I, do everything, just be completely upfront about everything. But yeah, at the end of the day, the trust principle is just, don't violate the readers, the sources trust. And, I think as an institution, that's a pretty strong culture. And I think that exists in many of the more hard news type publications. Obviously, it's a bit different if you're more in opinion analysis, things like that.
Right.
It's, facts, you can still be pretty black and white about the facts.
When you're writing your articles, how do you choose? First, do you use images in your articles? that you write, the longer ones.
Yeah. I mean, they'll, it'll get packaged with photos when it goes on Reuters.com, but on the wire, we put out photos, we put out text, and the clients can decide whether or not they want to use them both. But in general, if you put photo, text, and video out together, those are always the most used stories. Like these days, people want everything. Most of the time I don't shoot the photos, but sometimes I go on trips and I've got to shoot the photo, got to shoot the video because I'm the only person there. But most of the time it's handled by, colleagues who do just photo or just video. And like, say, if it's not a story that, I went out to do anything, it's more research phone based. Like, yeah, they'll look into the archive and pull a file photo. The photo editor will think, what's the best photo to go with this? And put it down. And same sometimes happens with archived video footage, but a bit less. Video, it's more immediate. Like, you wouldn't pull up an old video most of the time.
So it depends on a story-to-story basis when you use like a stock file photo or when you actually go out there to click something.
Specificities.
Right. Yeah. If there's something fresh, we'll always use the fresh thing we got that day. But especially these days in the pandemic, like I'm doing all my work. I mean, I've only gone out for 2 stories and the rest, it's all, I work the phones, I talk to sources, I do interviews all remotely. So it doesn't leave a lot to see.
Yeah. And I feel like the photo editor job would be really cool. Just sit around and pick pictures for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty high pressure just because, when X, Y, or Z happens, Bolsonaro gets stabbed, which happened.
What?
How can you get, he got stabbed on the campaign trail. How can you get photos of that as fast as possible? And oftentimes these things happen on off hours. And, I mean, that's the news business, but these editors have to be like, Neymar got hurt. We've got to fly somebody to be outside of his hospital, like when he comes out, and we need to get the picture then. And like, it can be pretty high pressure, I would say.
Wow.
And in general, these editor jobs, there aren't that many of them. And like, these guys have had, great careers to that point as photographers out in the field. And, there are only so many of these jobs. Most photographers are stringers, freelancers, and they can make a great living on it. But like, that kind of more set jobs is kind of the cream of the crop, I guess I would say.
Nice.
Yeah, I like the separation that there is a kind of I don't know if it's a separation, but there's a specialist within the journalism discipline that has a very different role inside, because journalism primarily, I would say, text, no? Like, that's most part of its history.
There's a huge, debate over like, backpack journalists were like the big thing that they were telling us about in college, like 15 years ago. And like, one person doing it all, blah, 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 which, I have had to do that. But I would say like, generally when people are specialized, it produces better stuff. I like the photos and videos I take, but are they as good as my colleague who just does photos and spends all of his time thinking about photos and what makes a good photo and like, can, flip his camera settings, like kind of half thinking, like, doesn't even really have to think about it as he is doing it. No, they're not that good.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Okay, let's move towards, go back to one of the things that we kind of noticed or while we were going through your research is that you worked in Beijing and now in Brasilia. Both of these are like capital cities in a way. Capitals. What makes you want to work in a capital of a country? Like, especially considering that you haven't really worked in DC, right? From where?
Correct. Yeah.
So these are different countries in the world. How do you look at the capital cities in this, and what makes you want to work in such a space? Is a capital city different from any other city to work in, for example?
I mean, a capital city is just like the power center. So, I mean, the new policies, the new information, a lot of it comes out of here, and a lot of the less predictable things, because politics is determined by humans, and like they've got to say it for us to know what is the new policy. So, I mean, it's more the jobs dictate where I live than any thinking about capital cities. And like capital cities need journalists because of what I just said. So I would say it's more to do with that. I mean, I've lived in, Wisconsin, right outside of Chicago at Northwestern. I've lived in Nanjing, which is a city in southern China. I've lived in Shanghai. I've lived in Beijing, and now I've lived in Brasilia. So there's a good mix there. I mean, I would say that living in capital cities, just to bring it back to architecture, I mean, I get to enjoy some of the best architecture in the world, because a lot of these places, that invest in striking architecture or iconic architecture are the capitals, because, it's some weird sort of branding almost. So like in Beijing, I used to always commute on a scooter. And back then you could drive right by Tiananmen Square, right between the gate with the Mao picture and the square. And I used to do that every single day on my way to work. And I mean, it really...
You're talking about Chang'an, right?
Yeah. And it really makes
anymore?
you... No, they, towards the end of when I was there, they outlawed it. You can bicycle past now, but you can't. No motorized scooters.
Okay.
It's a safety thing. They're concerned, obviously about attacks and things like that. There was an attack, but that was a car. So I don't know. I don't know what the deal is with the scooter rule. And it's just, it really, that imprints on you like, wow, I am in this place that is, unique in the world. And there's a reason I'm here as a journalist. Like, and it impresses on you, like, I mean, it is the image everybody knows of China. And it's like, wow, I'm really here living it firsthand. And, in Brasilia here, I've had 2 different commutes because we moved offices, but every day I would, when I first moved here, I would walk by the Don Bosco Church, which is this famous church that is made all out of these like tiny pieces of blue glass. And so over the course of the day, it's like lit up differently, and, it creates a very cool effect inside. And, I used to get to walk by that every day. And now when I used to go to the office, I again have to walk through the equivalent of Chang'an, right past the government buildings. And, you look down and you can see Congress with the 2 bowls and all the Niemeyer architecture and all the ministries lined up on the sides. And it's a longer walk, but it's cool. It's like every day, you get reminded, oh, yeah, I am in the capital. It's right there.
Is there something striking about that architecture? Do you find it like...
You're talking about Brazil, right?
Yeah, Brasilia right now. Like, is there something overwhelming about it, or what does it evoke in you? Or does it evoke anything?
I don't know. It's like, I always refer to it as like Brasilia is living in like Disney's Tomorrowland. Like, it's like what people thought the future would be back in the 60s or the 50s. And like, literally, yeah, I think, it does look like some of that Disney stuff built way back then at Disney World or something, that like, this is what the future will be like. So, I mean, it is, I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like, it does impress upon you that this is a place with a history, and it's not the same as everywhere else in the world. It doesn't look the same as anywhere else in the world. But in terms of what it makes me feel, I guess showing up, I was just surprised how much smaller things are than I thought. This Niemeyer architecture, like you see it in pictures, and it seems so, majestic and huge, and these big, surfaces and things like that. And then you see it, and it's like, oh, it's actually kind of, small. It's like compared to like the U.S. Capitol building, which is gigantic in comparison to anything here. So I found that pretty interesting. And I don't know, it's interesting to be in a place where it has a somewhat cohesive visual style, where they let Niemeyer come in and, you know, and work with the same landscape architect and I forget the other one. And they like set the standards for the city. And if it's shaped like an airplane, and if you're in the wings of the airplane, where I live, where most of the residential is, there are certain rules you have to follow, like the ground floors. Nobody can live on the ground floor, basically. All the ground floors are pillars that you can see through. So like, you know, and all the buildings have to be 6 stories tall or less. And like, it creates this kind of cohesion that it's like, almost like, am I on a college campus? Like what is going on here? So that's interesting about Brasilia. And the other thing I will just say is that it's not completely uniform. There's some very interesting things that have kind of just sprouted up freeform around this, and the kind of messier development that's actually also, I think, equally interesting, this kind of contrast. Like 2 roads away is where, when they were building this city, it's a, you know, made up city. It's I forget what the term is, but, you know, there are only so many capitals that they picked. Like, we're going to build a capital in this random place. Mm-hmm. And I've been to a lot of them. I've been to Abuja in Nigeria is one of them. Washington, D.C. is one of them. Brasilia is one of them. I guess I need to go to Canberra in Australia. And like, there's like Naypyidaw in Myanmar. And what was I going to say about that? But it's kind of like they always envision it in a certain way, and it's always supposed to be a model city. And then how it actually happens is a bit different. So they created it in the middle of like these arid highlands where, you know, half the year it's extremely dry. And, you know, they built these kind of shanty cities for the workers when they were building the city. And 2 streets away is where like the engineer families and the architect families lived. And they just decided, we're going to build our houses here. And you go over there and it's like, they knocked down a lot of the shanty towns, but these kind of more middle-class people had more clout. Yeah. And they're like, you're not going to knock down our houses. And so it's this weird mishmash of strange architecture, and people built however they felt like, in huge houses and tiny houses, all like put together. And there's always a lane for like driving, and then a lane of like trees and like nature between. And it's like 3 rows of this. And it's just such a bizarre, like mishmash of completely everything from completely ugly to completely like unique, beautiful architecture in there. It's really pretty strange. And that's one of the things that's not symmetrical. If you go up to the north side, like that doesn't exist, because for whatever reason, they're like, we're going to build our shit right here. Sorry, one sec. I got to just plug in my computer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like it does that kind of shows 2 things, at least at first sight. First, like you mentioned, people with clout. That means even in a capital city, architecture somehow can represent the power structures, basically. How people, who's talking to whom, who's a favorite of whose, and kind of where they live still tells you. Even in a city like Brasilia, where the whole idea was to have this, you know, complete democratization of what should happen in the future, and make everything uniform, make everything look similar. Everyone gets, similar housing quality and things like that. And something like that still exists, or manages to survive this kind of new aspiration that they planned back then. So that for sure, it still shows. And somehow architecture was used to became sort of the tool in showing how these relationships work.
I mean, I also think.
I mean,
yeah. No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, it's interesting how like they built this city for like a lot of it is for what they envisioned people wanted in the 1960s. Like my apartment is unnecessarily large. It's got a place where a maid could live in the back, and it's like nowadays it's something that if you live in one of these apartments in the wings, built according to the rules that Nehemiah and I'm mixing his name with Nehemiah, I think, but came up with, then you're actually very upper class probably these days. It was supposed to be this common thing, and like, they're all built around what are blocks or blockus, and everyone was supposed to have a bakery, or like there's a commercial street out front. And like everyone had a primary school, and then every fourth one had a middle school, and every eighth one had a high school. And like it was supposed to be one size fits all. But how, now you're probably, middle class at the very least to live in one of these buildings. And the people who live over in those like mishmash of buildings, which, are variously maintained, might actually be poorer now.
That's the strangest gentrification that I can think of.
But that said, I mean, like if you're actually working class, you probably live outside of the pilot plan. You live in a suburb. It's, that sort of deal that is more, like in Paris and stuff, the poor areas aren't in the city, they're the suburbs. It's the, reverse of the United States. And one of the reasons that it's because they made this artificial lake here. And I'd be interested to hear if you have opinions on artificial lakes, because they were big on them in Brazil at a certain point. Like the guy who designed Brasilia, he did the exact same thing in a city not that far away. And he's like, we're going to just make a lake right here. And they basically flooded huge amounts of the areas where the like working class builders lived. So it was like, okay, we're done. Get the fuck out. There's a small area in the middle that didn't get flooded that's probably existed since then. But otherwise, if you're working class, you had to go, the periphery.
At least I don't know anything about why people were obsessed with artificial lakes, apart from running water, it being a source of water containment.
No, but there's also been always this within the elements kind of an idea.
The 5 elements.
It's always like a elements idea, water as
earth, Captain Planet stuff.
Yeah, Captain Planet stuff taken to really serious proportions to create
expensive Captain Planet stuff.
But on a more serious note, if you also look at how Corbusier does the Schulen Villa, he makes a building as a landscaping artifact. One of the readings is that it's like a piece which sits in the landscape, and it has to be, it's almost like a huge stone sitting in a park.
You know Corbusier, right? You've heard of him.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, he was let's say a pioneer, father of modernism in architecture. His earliest and most famous works are from around the turn of the century, 20th century, and I think the last stuff I know is around 70s. And he has also built a huge state capital, like a provincial capital in India, right from scratch. The same time Brasilia was being built.
Yeah.
And he was personally invited by the first prime minister of India, to come and design that. So Niemeyer and Corbusier are often mentioned in the same breath if people are talking about urban design or urban planning and things like that, at least as far as
they were
principles and these ideas are concerned, because they wrote also about the ideas.
The Siam chapter,
and they wrote down manifestos of how this should be done and why, and what it means for the for a modern world. They kind of conceptualized what architecture should do in an industrial and a modern future. And a lot of that still happens. I mean, we constantly rethink a lot of that, but a lot of those things are somehow embedded in the DNA of what goes on anywhere around the world, including where we used to be in Beijing. There's a lot of little details or even systems that are applied across cities in China that can be traced back to some of the writings and thoughts of especially these two, and some more, of course. This is a very, very rich discourse. But anyway, since Corbusier came up, and he was specifically talking about a house that Corbusier designed in Ahmedabad, India, which is very famous for.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost read like a sort of element, like when you do landscaping in your garden or something, you know, like you put these huge boulders somehow. So if you imagine a building being a huge boulder, you know, it's got its very crisp, precise lines, but it's also considered to be like this huge block monolith sitting in an idea of a landscape. And then you can start to
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I since you're a journalist, maybe you're also interested to know that was also a time where metaphor was a very important means of conceptualizing architecture. So there was a lot of talk in terms of a house is a machine for living, you know, and the whole city is a house, and things like that were often said and proclaimed by authors and architects to help conceptualize some of what we have ended up with, like in your case, Brasilia, in our case, Chandigarh as a city in India.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the only reason I think I can look at artificial lakes being justified is then if it's a capital and everyone's running hyper, then you need to show them some water to calm them down. I think that's as far as this might go also. But I mean,
Right, yeah.
I don't know. Do you look at architecture as something that reports culture or society?
I don't know. Maybe it's on that reading. I mean, I think kind of more of the, free form stuff speaks to it more than, the architect who comes in with a vision. Like, I mean, I was thinking about that. And in Brazil, like, what is more the defining look of Brazil is I can go to any small town in the Amazon or around Brasilia or, even on the coast, and things all kind of look a similar style because they're all using the same, like, really cheap building materials. And like that is almost more defining of the look than like, it's actually more exceptional for somebody to come in and say, I'm going to build this, this uniform city with this uniform feel. And so I would associate, more with the style of Brazil and the Brazilian culture, this kind of more, messy development, and kind of, is injected more with the Brazilian casualness about everything. And, partially because it's a place where it's, it doesn't get cold, like the weather's pretty okay. Like you don't need to build these superstructures to be able to survive. You can survive with a hammock and like, a little roof. Like, so yeah, I mean, but certainly I'm sure like architects, like, they're trying to say something with their architecture, but, how much that hews to their vision of the culture, or how the culture should be. And I feel like there's more of like a should in there than an is. Like this was Niermeyer's version of like what he thought Brazil should aspire to. And, obviously it went off the tracks pretty quick. There's not a bakery in every block. The blocks have like become a free for all, and like, it leads to some weird phenomena. It's like one block is all pharmacies, and you're like, why would you want only pharmacies or only electronic stores? But the stores start to group together, and so now you can't walk down to your bakery. You got to go get in your car and go to a block which has a bakery, or go to the block which has electronics, or go to the block that has pharmacies. And it's like, this is not like it was envisioned as every block would be its own community with everything you need. And so that's one sign. Another sign is just like they thought people would be big on buses. But of course, everybody, like if they have another option, they'll take another option versus a bus. And so like the city was designed for buses, but then everybody just was like, well, we're going to get our own cars. And so
I'm out.
it hasn't run exactly how they envisioned, but yeah, it was an interesting idea. There was another thing I was going to say about that, just in terms of like the opulence of which it was built, these striking buildings, but Brasilia is crumbling, it's falling apart. Like they are having a lot of trouble maintaining all this stuff. Buildings will fall down, parts of roads will fall apart. Like, it's kind of disconcerting living here, going under an underpass, being like, this could collapse on me. So it's kind of this Disney's Tomorrowland that's also kind of decaying.
That's a common problem with cities that were built up at the, like everything in it was built up at the same time, because everything's going to go bad at the same time.
When they start from scratch, it's the tabula rasa situation. But I also think something has to be also said about this idea of when you speak of this opulence of sorts, like there are sort of these power structures embedded within these kind of experiments, right? And you being a journalist see this very clearly. It comes to the fore more clearly.
It's like that fresh eyes thing you said. Like, things that we've been reading and sort of been focused on. We don't see certain things the way you would.
Yeah, I mean, we were reading and looking at someone speak about how architecture aestheticizes power, or embeds power structures within. It becomes more apparent. You see power because of that. And some of the things that you talk about today also some of them are like balls to the walls hilarious when all the pharmacies and all the bakeries get grouped in certain places together. But some of the things are very interesting, when you say you look at these government buildings, but they are still in decay. How do you start to reconcile
it's like this strange feel-good story that is still told, but the realities of it are absolute tragedy.
Yeah,
because this is like the 20th century feel-good aspirational. The war is over. We're all just gonna go in one direction, and we're gonna be all a big happy family. And then the Cold War, but then the end of history. But and then we're left with. Do you know the phrase what white elephants mean? Afraid.
I know the game that we play at Christmas in my family, where we all bring old gifts and then exchange them, and that's called a white elephant. So I'm imagining it's not that.
That I don't know. In India, we say white elephant basically means something that's too expensive to maintain.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that sounds like it's.
Someone's going to steal your white elephant.
But the other thing I was going to say about Brasilia is that, and about journalists in general, is I feel like how we get to enjoy a lot of architecture that I guess a lot of people don't get to. Like I can get a press pass and I can go into the presidential palace. I can go into the Congress. I can, I could go into the Supreme Court or, whatever.
Yeah.
And in Beijing, same thing. Like I've, run through the Great Hall of the People to like get the news first. And I'm like, not a lot of people get to do this. And, it's this opulence.
I'd be shy if I was running there.
What's that?
I'd be shot if I was caught running there.
Yeah. I mean, we were running to get, the annual government report, and that they stack up on tables on the second floor, and you're all running upstairs, like trying to grab it.
Does anyone get a video of that happening? That'd be great meme material.
I feel like, if somebody hasn't done that, good God, what low-hanging fruit for a good story. The meta story is actually a pretty good story. But yeah, it's interesting, these kind of public projects, they're meant to be public spaces, but actually access is kind of, restricted to these public spaces. Mm-hmm. So I suppose you can go and look at the outside and feel like, this represents my country, and I'm so proud we were able to build this. But at the same time, you can't go into these public buildings unless you have permission. So
in Germany, I think you can get an appointment and go to the Reichstag.
You can go there but even there, in most public buildings also, even in India, if you go there, they sort of have
closed area for
closed areas, and then there are these public access areas. So those boundaries are very strongly established, at least now. I mean, maybe some years ago it wasn't the case,
But it's great, the whole idea of the fourth pillar of democracy. Whether you are in a democracy or not, somehow the fourth pillar works even in China.
You can. I was just going to say, you can take a tour of most of the government buildings here in Brazil. Probably not so much in China.
But the fourth pillar also sort of has access to architecture that is at the sort of height of power, that is so charged with power, and can sort of either experience it and convey the experience outside, and journalism brings that back to the outside, or even report directly. This is very common. The images of, let's say, a Chinese premiere are rarely on a desk, like the number of images you'll see on the internet of the Oval Office itself, the inside of it.
Yeah.
Right. That's true.
And that's an architectural comment as far as I'm concerned, because for me, it's showing the Chinese premiere in the Great Hall, or at a big rally, or something on those lines, or on a big table with him leading a meeting with a lot of people there discussing or taking instructions. These are sort of regimes, visual regimes, that as a journalist you seem to encounter at very, very close quarters, and have the sort of privilege of going back and reporting. And architecture sort of sits right in the middle of it all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, politics is to some degree theater, and the theater needs a set. So
that's very well put. I like that analogy there. Sounds. I have one question that just comes because you mentioned something about that you recording the journalists running to get that report, and then this idea of reporting that itself as a meta project. How often does journalism go meta?
Increasingly more so. I mean, you could argue my podcast is entirely meta, but you'll also see like New York Times and Reuters and many places, like on the biggest stories, they'll have, a sidebar, the story about the story, or here's how we told this story. And I mean, supposedly people want more transparency about how this stuff is done, which kind of runs counter to the tradition where it used to be always like, you should make it about the subject and not about yourself. But it's interesting that to some degree, while people actually do want to know who is bringing them the news and how they're bringing the news, so they know if they can trust it or not. So yeah, it's been interesting to see things go in that direction. And I don't entirely know how I feel about it. I feel like my instincts are kind of to not, despite the podcast, my instincts are to keep myself out of my work. But is that the right instincts? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's also a tough position to take when the podcast is about introducing a person every week.
Yeah.
It's the idea that this is a person, it's a journalist, takes his or her job extremely seriously, and this is their life. You're putting it out there, so it's kind of tough to not have to think about the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis, having access to hearing, listening, and then disseminating those kind of stories as well. No, it gets to that point also.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely do think about it. And, I think we are pretty transparent in our work to maybe to a fault. Reuters, like every sentence will be cited to something like, you will read a story and you will know exactly how we got it. And that can be frustrating to me if I'm, say, reading a newspaper and they just say something as a fact. I'm like, well, how do they know that? And I ask this as a journalist, of course, because I want to prove everything. But it's ridiculous of me to not think that a normal person might ask that question and that somehow I have a right to ask it, but they don't. So I think it is valid to want to know exactly and trace the path your news has taken to get to you.
Do you ever get flack for stuff that you say or hear on your podcast from your journalist friends?
No, I don't think I have. Like, certainly, my journalistic work, like I would say every journalist gets, trolls and things like that. But in terms of feedback on the podcast itself, I would say it's been overwhelmingly positive. I try to use it to be a booster of journalism. And I think, it's hard to hate on that. But
I like how he puts it. It's hard to hate on
that. But yeah, when I first started, I wasn't sure how, people would react. I try not to it's not an opinion-y type thing. And like, as Reuters is very, very neutral. And like, even now, when I was talking about the job earlier, like I try to keep everything straight and factual. Because you don't want to bias yourself, as it's called. You don't want to show bias that people, if you're later reporting on this or that, people say, but you said that 3 years ago, and this shows you were out to get us in the first place, that sort of thing. Like, so, I mean, it's most of the time, it doesn't veer that way. And that's why it's more of like telling the stories and things like that than debating, say, the big ideas in journalism today, Yeah, Reuters is like, consistently like the most neutral. We're like true neutral in Dungeons and Dragons, basically, or Switzerland or whatever you want.
Switzerland is not very neutral. If you've seen what's that movie about the Wall Street?
Wolf of Wall Street?
Yeah. You see the scene where Leo DiCaprio figures out how to hide his money, and the French Swiss banker in front of him. They're neutral to those that wish to access that neutrality by specific means. Let us put it that way.
Yeah.
So, Jake, do you have any questions for us?
So I have several notes.
So we're not like speak to power. We have no power. So
So I only have one question like that. I guess I'll start with the more closed end ones. I watched this movie last night called Last and First Men, I believe it is. Yeah, Last and First Men, which is like, if I had to describe it in a few words, I would say it's sci-fi architecture porn narrated by Tilda Swinton.
Wow.
And the whole time I was watching it, I was like, wow, Andy would fucking love this. Like, For me, I found it extremely difficult to watch for the first 20 minutes because it's just like shots of like architecture and Tilda Swinton talking in black and white and like, occasionally weird swirls going by.
You gotta see it.
But once you acclimate to it, like by the end of it, I was so into it. Like, it was like 1 star for the first 20, 30 minutes and then like 5 stars for the end of it. I'm like, oh no, it's over now already. It's a vibe for sure. And so next, I guess I won't go in order of, but definitely check that out. I'd be interested to get your
for
opinion.
sure.
You should talk about it on a future episode. But that made me think of brutalism. And I've been thinking a lot about brutalism in architecture lately because I did a podcast with a guy in Russia and we talked about it. And just like, I feel like brutalism is maybe having a moment right now. And I've had an evolving relationship with it because I grew up in Wisconsin near University of Wisconsin-Madison, which has a lot of brutalist architecture, and Northwestern, the library and the student union is both built in that style, this kind of very stark, lot of concrete, kind of, I don't know. I feel like it feels very Russian, even though it's not originated in Russia. And, feels like Soviet or sorrowful
Did
or
I ever
industrial.
tell you the brutal in brutalism where it comes from?
No.
Brutal is basically just when the French talk about concrete that hasn't been painted or plastered over.
It's brute.
It's raw concrete that usually used to get plastered and painted over so that the concrete itself doesn't get affected by the elements or for decoration or whatever. And the steel inside is protected and that the structure lasts longer because it's not made out of stone that's used to the elements and sort of gets stronger and stronger over time. It's concrete, so some protection is required. And then they found ways of building with concrete where they absolutely didn't need any kind of protection. And it began to have an aesthetic moment where more and more architects all over the world actually started using that as an aesthetic to show sort of progress and sort of post-war, kind of a little bit also before the war values of let's get this world back to where it should be and not have stupid.
But I also think what is very interesting is the kind of forms that, because it's concrete, it's free flowing. You can do what you want with it, but then there are within this brutalist architecture regime or this kind of this entire oeuvre that is there, the forms are very sort of strong, monolith kind of structures, and very volumetric in a way, and they're very heavy. I would say, like when you look at it, that is it. What is interesting for me is not that it did that and that's why it's called brutalism or anything. It is actually the fact that it was called this brutalism as the architecture itself, but then how these sort of forms get attached to this to this term itself. They start becoming so if tomorrow there's
this uncanny sort of relationship between the name and what the architects, because you take away a decoration, you take away and it's also a specific style that coincides. So in human civilization there has been sort of, you can point out times where a lot of universities were built within 50 years and then not too many for the next 50, and a lot of city halls were built in these 50 years, or especially in Europe, a lot of cities were destroyed in these periods and a lot were built back up in these periods. So they kind of come with a critical mass. They come with we have a lot of cousins all over the world at the time, because huge modern-looking university libraries are the thing that every big university in the world wants to do, because every big university in the world has a library that doesn't have enough space right now, because that many books have been written by now, where every university library needs to expand. This is very simplistic explanation, but I think you get what I'm saying. So there's
Yeah, I just wanted to say about my like evolving relationship with it, because when I was a teenager and when I was going to college, like we used to joke around like all these buildings are so extremely butt ugly. Like, who would have thought this was a good idea? Because I feel like back then, for people my age, like the platonic ideal of a university was like Harry Potter. We want to go to school at fucking Harry Potter. We want, that kind of old feeling, like whatever university style. And here we have these butt ugly concrete buildings. And so I feel like it was really in style in whatever the 70s, and then kind of went out of style. And I feel like it's back now. And I'm curious if it took the same trajectory among the opinions of architects, if it was kind of out of style and is coming back at all. And I just say that also because now, like, there's the Instagram account Cats of Brutalism. Have you seen this?
No.
Where it's you take the heaviest, most brutal thing, brutalist architecture, and then you Photoshop cats, like the lightest, cutest thing on top of them. And so it'll be buildings in brutalist style all around the world with like a cat hanging off of it or like whatever. And yeah, now I'm like, maybe I do kind of like get some enjoyment out of brutalism, and obviously other people must be too if they're photoshopping cats on images of it. So I feel like I'm also find it more interesting now than I did when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I
20s.
guess the history of it is not that
but
important.
what you're saying, I think what Jake says, Cats of Brutalism becomes one of the most radical critiques of brutalism itself when you place because like I said, there is no specific explanation for what you call butt ugly and what we call hard, brutal architecture to kind of exist for in its form, in the
forms.
way.
I mean, it's basically rhetoric. You can call it many different things, and it would be. I mean, is it making a comeback? No. It's a curatorial comeback.
Yeah.
People are having a consumption resurgence, right? Like they want to consume those images. Yes, that like a curatorial comeback. Yes, if you have a Instagram profile that's all about brutalism and you do something peculiar with it, yeah, it's gonna be popular because people love consuming it. But I don't think people are discussing, at least as far as I know, within architecture, because it also moves really slow. Like the client comes to you, and by the time the client actually gets the keys to whatever building, whether it's a house or I think a minimum of 3 years in the normal world where we don't do things like China does, a minimum of 2 to 3 years, or it could take a decade if it's big enough.
Right.
So it moves really slow. So I haven't heard anything where people are saying, let's do some more brutalism.
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. Yeah. There's enough already out there. And yeah, then the only other question, because we already kind of talked about crumbling architecture and, maintenance via Brasilia. But my other question was, are architects concrete death merchants? Discuss. Which is basically like, with environment and climate change, like a journalist I know I've had on the podcast did like a story that won an award about like how specifically bad concrete is for the world and for the environment and how everything is made out of it and how we're screwing ourselves. And so yeah, how do you feel about the role of architects and all that?
At the moment, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a name that can be can make sense for architects. Yes, not just concrete, glass would do the same thing too. I mean, yeah, but I think I love the phrasing of that. But I think it's a much bigger problem that we in architecture are trying to understand. Not just understand, actually understand it pretty well. Don't let anyone tell you we don't understand it. We don't have a means of staking, let's say, our professional and ethical force, thrust on what is called the markets. And you yourself, I mean, we should build with the least amount of concrete. We should build with more natural ventilation. We should avoid destroying landscapes that have their own ecosystems, not try to expand cities too much, go for density or not. I mean, nothing is a simple answer, of course, but a lot of this will not be a simple solution for a while. We architects will on one side have to play death merchants and court jesters all at the same time for a while till things come to a point where we can build more friendly.
I mean, I agree with...
I mean, how are you going to tell somebody to pay 3 times what a building would normally cost because you're like, hey, just can't use concrete, man. It's like, it's available. I can buy it for you.
I agree with what his latter sort of formulation, but I don't quite agree with your former. Like when you say, yeah, you can say someone who builds in concrete or in glass as concrete or glass death merchants. I also think there is a lot of architecture that is not done by architects in a way.
Oh, absolutely. I actually go back on my word.
So,
there's way more architecture that's not done by architects. Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, we need to get into...
Then there's a lot of also new cities coming up where this won't exist anymore. Architects will be building it.
Yes, and that's where I think... And that is where I agree with the latter part, where I say that yes, when we do have discussions about materials, we do have discussions about in all our when we were studying architecture, and even now when we work, we do have those kind of discussions. It's just about the kind of the idea of the expertise and the agency, and then there being a certain kind of trust which should be earned. Putting it out there, which should be earned. And then when we begin to intervene, we take those responsibilities and make sure that they reach their due conclusions in a way, So I wouldn't say...
At least they find place in a project. I mean, it's easy to conceptualize. Not easy. It feels great to sit on our drawing boards and conceptualize something that's really, really not, self-sufficient, energy-wise, blah, blah, blah. But someone's gotta, you need a client that wants it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm just saying, I mean...
Or a government that enforces it.
Yeah.
At least one of the two.
And I would say, fine. I mean... I'm ready to stop using concrete tomorrow.
Yesterday,
yeah. I don't care. Give me something that's as versatile as it is.
And there is there's so much that can do what concrete can do.
Yeah, there are now materials that are there in the market. I can agree. But then what about the cost, like you mentioned? You have to bring those things down. And
there's a lot of other, whoever is mining concrete cement out of the hills, I don't know who his friends are,
Yeah.
Because there has been enough complaining about concrete for 30 years in architecture, and now outside also. Even Greta Thunberg is pissed about it, but
right, yeah.
I don't know. We still haven't found the leader of the concrete world to tell him that You like that? I like that. Leader of the concrete world.
Leader of the concrete world.
Yeah, no, and I realize that, we're all just cogs in this greater machine. But yeah, I mean, I was interested to know your thoughts just because, you're in this system and you can't necessarily do that much about it. But
we can, but we have to sort of, there are other ways of doing it. Let's save that, because that's a conversation in itself. I'm not trying to not answer it. I'm just saying that is a great conversation, but a conversation in itself for another podcast, including that architecture porn movie you talked about. We can discuss those two.
I think the next
one.
two can be these. The next podcast we do with you is going to be Concrete Death Merchants Discuss. Act 1 and Act 2 is talking about the movie itself, because architecture within movies is actually amazingly, it's been documented. There are productions.
I want to blame Hollywood also. Like the number of movies that show like amazing glass and concrete buildings around the world, and I think Hollywood plays a big part in disseminating what a modern skyscraper should look like for the whole world. You can blame Hollywood for it, because that is what led to first Dubai, then Shanghai, then the business district in Beijing, and a lot more, because people saw what the Americans did.
Right, yeah.
It's all true. Your fault is what I'm trying to say.
Architectural imperialism.
Way before Mr. Trump came in.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking for 2 hours, so I guess we can leave it there. I was also just going to say, I was curious if you guys are familiar with the work of, let me pull it up, sorry. I'm trying to remember of the author's name. He's the guy who wrote The Great Derangement. His name is Amitav Ghosh.
I love him.
And I've read him quite a bit.
I love him.
And, it's kind of about climate change, but it's also just about how imperialism kind of shaped how we lived.
Yes.
I don't know how old it is. And it's like discussing we have this idea that like cities are always built on water and things like that. Well, actually, that's something that like colonialists and stuff came up with. And we used to like live more sustainably and stuff, but basically it's about, how imperialism fucked everything. So,
he's an anthropologist.
Talks a lot about Southern Asia. So it's always talking about like Bangalore and things like that.
Yeah. There was a time when I went through all The Circle of Reason, The Glass Palace. These are great, great books. I went through almost everything he had written over a period of 2 or 3 years. And then I guess I moved on to other stuff. But yeah, this guy's amazing, even in his fiction. He's an anthropologist who writes also fiction. So, I mean, I love his literary style and also his sort of perspective on how he sees things.
Yeah. But maybe also a topic for another time.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. It's
great feeling.
Yeah.
Episode number 3, Jake Spring. We are ending with 3 pretty big topics to discuss already. Yeah. Friends of the Broadcast Interrupted podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jake, for taking out the time and speaking with us. I think this has been great.
Thanks for having me on. I feel like I had more to say than even I expected, and I thought it was pretty interesting and fun.
Yeah, that was amazing. We'll make sure we convey to you all the cutie pie comments that we get about your shirt once it's uploaded.
I hope it's not too gringo fabulous, leaning into the gringo and Hawaiian shirt thing.
So there you go, guys. That was our conversation with Jake Spring. Hope you enjoyed it. Follow us on Instagram at broadcast.interrupted for links and updates on our upcoming episodes. Our podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on YouTube in video form. So like it, share it, And most importantly, let us know what you think. Thank you.
Ciao.